Even though I've been woodworking for a couple decades now, and me and my dad now share this really great 450 square foot shop, I'm now in a situation that a lot of brand new woodworkers are. I have some space problems. You see, in the coming months, I'm building a little camper so I could travel the country creating woodworking related content, stuff that other people just won't be able to do very easily. And in order to financially make that work, I've got to have access to a shop so I can work on the road. I need this functionality, if not the efficiency, to fit in the back of my pickup. Or more specifically, the 4 feet by 8 feet I'll have underneath this camper I salvaged from the junkyard. Now, supposedly I'm a hand tool woodworker, and having a mobile workshop isn't that big a deal for us, because basically you just build yourself a toolbox, load all the tools you use daily in there, and you take the box with you. As long as you have a workbench that you can work on, you're all set. In fact, that's kind of where that term journeyman has came from. Somebody that just journeyed from shop to shop or worksite to worksite. In fact, a lot of people nowadays do that one in the construction industry. You have that big, huge tank of a pickup truck with all your tools and stuff like that. It's just going to be a little bit different in the kind of woodworking I do, and that y'all come to my channel to work and see. You see, I still earn a very large portion of my income with production woodworking. I have wholesale clients that I have to supply with inventory, and making that inventory demands that I sacrifice electrons to the gods of productivity. There's no way I can meet the demands any other way. I really do need access to a bandsaw. The thickness planer makes my life so much easier, and there's no way I could do a lot of stuff I do without the lathe. So those are tools that just won't fit in a toolbox. Plus, I like having a workbench, and workbenches aren't really that mobile. So what's my solution? Something that I think a lot of y'all will appreciate in smaller spaces? Well, I'm going to build a knockdown workshop. Something I can take down and put up in less than 5 minutes. Otherwise, it's too much of an inconvenience to do it. Something that will give me the functionality, if not the efficiency, of this place. Now, ever since I came up with this idea of going on the road to make content and still trying to meet my production goals, I've been struggling with the idea of how to make this knockdown workshop. I mean, I have designed rolling tool stands for my lathe and a lot of other stuff, and when you sit back and you look at it, those just take up way too much space. Then while I was working one day over at my lathe, I looked over here and I saw my miter saw station. And 12 years ago, or 10 years ago, when I first got it and when I opened up a woodworking school, I bought this and this, a smaller version of it, for the simple reason that in order to prepare for classes, I had to do a lot of production work stuff, cutting up boards and everything like that to size. But I didn't want young students to be wandering around the shop, touching sharp blades, maybe hitting a power button that I forgot to unplug or something like that. So with using these, I could basically put the stuff up out of the way right before class really quickly, just hanging on a thing, and students wouldn't even be tempted, that kind of stuff. As the years progressed, I started using these kind of setups in a lot of the shows I set up. If I was doing a demonstration, I would just build a little benchtop table that would sit on top of it and let people make chopsticks or carve a spoon or something like that. So in essence, I was setting up that knockdown workshop. I just didn't realize it. So if I were to use miter saw stations as a foundation for a lot of the power tools, I really only had to focus on building the tops, making the tops functional to work with that one and also accomplish a bunch of different things at that time. Hence, I went out and bought 2 more small stands and 1 large one. So I ended up with 2 large and 3 smalls, plus a whole bunch more of these to go along with the ones I already owned. And that will give me enough stations that I could have my knockdown workshop without having to worry about the foundational structure of all my benches. Now, I've worked with these exact models for years, and I can tell you they are really, really strong, but I'm not going to tell you they are the most stable. They're going to be a little bit of wiggle, but for most applications, that's not that big a deal because, you know, you can brace it with your body. There is going to be, you know, just a little movement because they are lightweight, but these particular joints are pretty strong. And it's not that wide this way, so, you know, it could be tippy if, you know, you're planing against it. But there's always workarounds for those kind of situations. It might just be I bump it one edge up against my truck or a tree or something like that to give it something to force against. Now, there are other competitions to these this particular model out there. I will tell you this, if you're going to do it, be consistent. It's not necessarily these that you got to worry about. It's the connectors to them. You want the same connectors to work on anything so you can have the most flexibility on what tools you are setting up on what station. Now, the bench tops I'm going to make is dependent upon the tools I'm going to be taking. Most definitely, I need some substitute for my workbench, and the biggest problem there is going to be bulk. That is an aspect of making a good workbench in my mind. But the other big thing is my turning setup. You know, I need my turning tools, which includes the lathe, a grinder, and a bandsaw. And chainsaw, you know, that doesn't need it, but those three things are kind of the holy trinity in the kind of production woodworking, wood turning I do. Now, I do want to take this stand, but in production work, I don't really like it, these kind of small stands, because where you stand, you're constantly bumping them with your legs. Having that one of those long ones seems like the ideal situation, even if you weren't needing to knock it down, because you could put this lathe in the dead center, so you're never bumping into those legs, and then just put the grinder right next to it. Or you could add a lathe bed extension at a later date, put the bandsaw on one side, and you have the holy trinity on one setup, which sounds really cool to me. Now, the bandsaw is a commonly enough used tool for me that it will have its own top. But having another generic top for tools that I can pick up and set on it, like my thickness planer, and for square box making, my scroll saw for inlay work, that would be really nice. I don't have to make one setup for those though. I can make a general platform and just set a lot of those power tools on there to save space in the truck. And while having other power tools like the table saw or a drill press would be a real nicety, maybe in the future I can pick up another one of those small job site saws, because I do have a mobile stand for that I hung on to. But things like a drill press, there are modern day solutions that will work with just a hand drill that can accomplish a lot of the accuracy and repeatability issues of a drill press, but once again, maybe not the efficiency. And access to a track saw will help out with you know, a lot of what the table saw is used for. Now, one of the design constraints is going to be the attachment points, because unfortunately when they design these, you don't attach to those stands in the middle. You attach to one side or the other, because these are actually designed for miter saw stands, and their weight is offset from where you're working. So that's kind of a design constraint in that you're never really sitting right on top of the tool. So like on my workbench, whenever I'm designing this right here, I'm basically going to turn it around so that the support is on the far side, because I'm constantly kind of working into it this way. If I were to have it turned around this way, the support would be here and it would be kind of tippy. That's going to be consistent with all the tools I'm using, is I don't want it to be tippy by the way I'm using it. Design constraints. Another design constraint is material. This is one of those situations that there just is no substitute from solid wood. I would not use plywood. I've had experience in these kind of setups using plywood, and because it's knocked down, you end up using it outside, it's gonna get wet. Somebody's gonna turn a sprinkler on, you're gonna go to lunch and a rainstorm's going to come through, and plywood just doesn't handle it. Even the treated stuff, which I wouldn't want to use anyways. whereas solid wood can get wet. It might warp when it gets wet, and we'll work around that one, but as soon as it dries in an hour or two, it will work back down. Solid wood's designed for being outside in the rain. I mean, trees stand there all the time. I'm going to be using southern yellow pine for my stuff simply because I live in the South and this is what we find for construction work. And I have been going through the stores and picking the best boards for 2 or 3 months now, and then just setting them out, stickering them to dry. Because you don't want to work with them straight from the store because they aren't fully dry, at least for the applications we want. We want to get that moisture content way down there. So sticking them outside for a few months, well worth it. Now to me, the workbench is the heart of what I'm doing, and I like the style of workbench that has a fairly thick, dense top. At least 3 inches thick is going to be the minimum for what I'm going to be doing. So real quickly, quick montage of me milling up that top. So there we go, a montage of the typical way I will make a benchtop workbench top. Something fairly thick and beefy, but made out of southern yellow pine, so it's not too heavy. I like those little montages, especially in long videos, because it kind of gives people a mental break. What I don't like about them is this. What did you learn? Think about it. You just watched me tilt up an entire workbench top. What did you pull out of that? I can almost guarantee that the only people that pulled information out was review information they already know. And a lot of the reasoning behind the processes, the steps I went through, kind of got lost on the people that I really wanted to learn that kind of stuff. So while montages like that are a good break in mine and other people's videos, if you don't watch them with the right eye, you end up not getting anything out of them other than a little entertainment. And you're never going to get that minute and a half back of your life. So real quickly, go back and rewatch it. Go back about a minute and a half. But this time, I want you to think about, why is he doing the steps this way versus maybe a way you know yourself? Why is he doing it differently? Why is he doing it similarly? And when you come back, I'm going to break down that little montage to explain the reasonings behind my process. So see you in a bit. Are you a professional wannabe woodworker? Do you also enjoy a nice, cold, frosty beverage in your shop? Then you need to get yourself a genuine, original, non-patentable, multi-function leather workshop coaster from Worth the Effort Woodworking. I'm okay. Does the idea of venturing all the way to the other side of your workbench to retrieve your sharpening stroke leave you mentally exhausted? Then you need a workshop coaster. Do you have a shop cat? Then you need a workshop coaster. Are you constantly stabilizing boards on your workbench? Bandsaw, thickness planer set, or miter saw? Then you need a workshop coaster. Would your workshop benefit from a sternum pad, clamp pad, gouge repeller, gouge hone, tracing jig, burnishing pad, burr remover, kid repellent, or spouse distractor? Or do you just need proof to all your woodworking buddies that you know what you are doing in the workshop? Then you need to get your own Texas-grown, Texas-made, genuine, original, non-patentable, multi-function leather workstroke coaster from Worth the Effort Woodworking. Get your 3-pack of Worth the Effort Woodworking workshop coasters for only $19.99 and 9/10. Shipping and handling included, while supplies last. Now, in an ideal world, all of us would have access to trees that had a 6-foot diameter. So you found the center of the tree right here, and you had over 3 feet of the tree this way and that way. And there's the dead center of the tree. Why? Because you could take one slab on this side that would be perfectly quarter sawn and at least 2 feet across, which is my ideal workbench size, have it all the way along. Unfortunately, we don't have access to those kinds of trees, especially in Texas, in the species that you want. In the old days, 1800s, yeah, they did. And you can find, I think Christopher Suarez did a great little thing on his French-English Ribot kind of build, where they built workbenches out of slabs like that. But again, we don't have that. But we could get a good proximity to that one if we work with what we have in a certain way. Because, as I've said, it's always about the grain. Now, we go buy a 2x12 from the big box stores. And most of the time, those wide boards are going to come from pretty close to the center of the tree. And you can find boards out there that are going to have the pith in them. Unfortunately, those boards, this center section right here, it's going to be trash. You can't really use it for anything other than to make heat, because no matter what you do there, it's going to crack on you. You can't control the movement because the entire growth ring is captured in that one board. You only need a portion of a growth ring if you want to control it somehow. But those boards on either side, those are the most premium boards for building fine stuff because they are quarter sawn boards. They will move the least, which is why if we could get a whole wide section of that in that one section, it'd be advantageous because it wouldn't move that much as it aged and dried. Because I knew I was building workbenches and I didn't want to waste my money with that center section, I specifically looked for boards that were just off of that pith, because they contain the grain that I could use throughout building not only this thick workbench, but a lot of the thinner, flatter ones for the other tools. And you notice that the very first thing I did in that montage is I went to each board and I marked the center of that pith, okay? I did that on both ends. I only showed one side. Now, I wanted a workbench, as I said earlier, that was at least 3 to 3.5 inches thick. So I needed to capture about 4 inches of wood. So what I would do is I went 2 inches on either side at both ends of the board to get the general idea to capture that center ring in this section. Now, why was that important? Well, remember, we're trying to get the facsimile of quarter sawn. If I were to take that board right there and rotate it, I end up with a quarter sawn board in the upright position. And if I glue a bunch of those together, I end up with the facsimile of a 2-foot wide quarter sawn board. That's really good for this really thick workbench. But if I had this board right here and I laid it out flat to make a thinner table, what's going to happen is this center section becomes the hinge of the movement. So both of these are going to end up coming down on either side. They'll be fairly straight on either side, fairly straight, but the biggest curve is going to be in the center section as those grains straighten themselves out as they dry. Down in the description, I'm going to put links to a couple of videos if this is confusing any of y'all. I go into great detail of how to work with grain within a tree. But my general thinking and a lot of what I do is that cathedrals are bad in most instances of woodworking. So if you take like kind of a 3D model of this, that grain is going to make a cathedral like that coming down. And then the quarter sawn stuff will look nice and straight on the sides. Now, if you put a cathedral in because they do look pretty, but in like a decorative portion, like a cabinet door that's framed, that's perfect. But if you have cathedrals on the rails and stiles and stuff like that, that's generally a sign that the person who made that piece was not taking grain into any consideration at all. So for the most part, when you're working with wood, I try and stay away from cathedrals unless it's cosmetic. That right there along a tabletop would have lots of cathedrals, which ends up causing problems later on down the road. So now when I assemble my tabletop, if you look, you will notice that most of my grain in the middle of the board is going straight up and down. It is pretty much quarter sawn. I will say this board right here, I put that one in there. There's a big knot in the middle I was just trying to hide. And as I worked out to the edge, I put those two side pieces that I captured, a few of them, on the outside just so that the grain would stay consistent all the way across and you wouldn't see cathedrals on the sides, the tops, bottoms, or anything like that. Plus the fact that if the very outsides move a little bit, it won't affect the entire thing. I'm not going to have a hinge in the middle. It'll stay relatively stable. So over the next few years, I might only have to flatten it once or twice, and then it will just solidify flat. But that wasn't the only consideration I was taking towards the grain before I started milling it up. You notice I took the time, oriented them the way I just explained to you, but then I oriented them this way and that way, discovering the grain direction. I would look at a board, I would analyze the grain, figure out which way the grain was moving, and then I would mark those arrows. Some boards, the grain reversed. But I would try to get the most of the grain going in one direction on every single board before I glued it up. That way, in the future, if I'm ever having to reflatten it or work it, or even on the initial stage of working it, I can move a blade across this entire tabletop knowing that all the grain is going in the same direction. If I didn't take that step, one board might be reversed and all of a sudden it'll be working fine and I'll get tear out all the way down the board. And this is something a lot of people don't take into consideration because they sand on that last finish. And sanding is very forgiving, but it kind of muddles the grain. So on a really high-end table, they will take those into consideration. Plus the fact that if you have species like walnut or something like that and you don't take that into consideration, the species that have a kind of a translucence to that surface finish that kind of glows, well, even if the boards are from the same tree and you don't have them going in the same way, meaning they grew in one direction and one's reversed, light will reflect differently. And those different boards will really pop out. And if you've ever walked across a showroom or something like that, you've seen a nice walnut table, but one board, when you move around of it, kind of pops out because it's a slightly different hue. That one board is not going in the same direction as all the other ones. So I took the time to align the grain so in future steps, I won't have issues. Then some of y'all that are power tool focused might notice that the very first thing I did when I started machining all these individual boards was wrong. I did not take the step to flatten the boards, to make them straight on the jointer. I just stuck them in my thickness planer, and if they had a cut, bow, twist, or anything like that, it didn't fix any of that. All it did was surface either side of the board and make it look pretty, make them parallel. And that was really my goal, because I know that Southern Yellow Pine, a 2x4, has some give to it. And if you notice, when I put all those boards together, oriented the way I wanted it to kind of mirror those imperfections, all it took was one clamp in the middle to lock all these joints together. I did go back and add more clamps in, but I really only needed that one clamp because those boards had some flex to it. So I didn't have to have every single board here dead flat. I did go ahead and joint the bottoms for the simple reason that when I did the glue up, you might have noticed I used those two stands as sawhorses. I took the time, I looked down, I kind of made sure that they were in plane. I even checked it with a plane to show y'all that's what I was doing. That's why I did that. It was more demonstrate to y'all. That way, when I did the glue up, I only had to reference two ends to get sure that this ended up really flat. Granted, I need to make some make pretty on this one before I do the next step, but that will be easy if I'm starting with something that's already flat. So when you watch that montage, I hope this showed you that there's actually a reason why I do certain things a certain way, even though it might not be the same for every single project. But generally, it always comes down to, it's about the grain and what I'm trying to accomplish in the project. The steps I take are dictated by the grain I have available to me. And if that wasn't shown to you in that video, again, I'm going to have some links down below to some videos that talk just about grain and how we use it. So now I'm going to take some time real quickly off camera just to make this pretty, and then when we come back, we'll get it ready to be a bench top on top of those miter saw stands. Now that the make pretty is done, I can put this on top of it. You can kind of see the proportions I'm working with. Now the lengthwise, I was just taking the boards I had out there, dividing by 3 to get me close to what I wanted. And as long as this was close to 20 inches, it's right around 19 inches, I was going to be happy with it. I was just using what was available to me. Everything's a bit of a compromise. Well, this is the same situation with these bases. As you can see, whenever you put the legs out, they taper both to the side and to the back a little bit for stability reasons, which means that I could put this in the dead center and not have much of an overhang, but the overhang from both forward, back, and left and right would compensate for these legs. But I don't want to do that one. I would like to have one side with a decent enough overhang to mimic what I have here. Now, any quality workbench, you need to be able to work on the end grain, the side grain, and the face grain. For the end grain, I'm going to be using a twin screw like I have for decades. And basically, when I'm using the twin screw, I like a foot forward stance. It just gives me a lot more control and stability. That way, my foot is actually underneath this overhang. So if I could design something with pretty close to this amount of overhang on at least one side, I'm going to be comfortable working on this workbench just like I have on this workbench, no matter where I am in the country. So for my use, I'm going to position this as close to one edge as possible and still keep the legs inside the edge. Next up, another compromise that we've just got to make because of the equipment we're using is, remember me talking about these, the connection is offset, it's not in the center. So I'm not going to be able to have this piece in the dead center to balance the weight. I'm actually going to have it closer to one edge or the other. So if I bring this closest to the face side that I'll be working on, that means this is going to be about there, which gives me just a little bit of clearance so I won't be bumping into it if I ever hang stuff off of the face. So now that I know where everything's going to be located, I can mark it out and I can work around those areas in my next steps. Yeah, no, real big surprise. Instead of actually doing measurements and math, I just take measurements directly off of pieces. Planned incompetence. And that next step is to drill dog holes in the workbench, because the dog holes are what's going to give me the ability to work on the edges and faces of my boards. And if you've seen me work on a workbench, you know that's how I've been doing it for years. I am going to say this. There are kind of two different philosophies for drilling dog holes in a brand new workbench. Some people say just run rows front down and not worry about it. Others say work with your workbench for a little while and then just drill the holes where you need them, because you'll end up with a lot fewer holes that would weaken the workbench. My personal opinion is, as you can see on this workbench, I just ran the holes down the sides because there's so much glue area, so much strength in this thick a workbench. I don't think it weakens it at all. And I would rather have holes available to use even if I never use them, just as setup. Next question is, how wide do you want to make the holes? Well, that depends entirely upon what devices you're using with it. A lot of people like square holes because they use the kind of pop-up dogs that just kind of sit in there permanently and the squares don't rotate around. Me personally, I like the round ones just because they're easy to do and they work with a lot of the tools I already have. These are actually a tad bit smaller than 3/4 of an inch. So if I drill a 3/4 of an inch hole, I have some wiggle room. And that wiggle room is what gets it to lock in, because it actually wedges from one side to the other as it goes down. Now, because I do not have the straight legs to pound on, I'm not going to be using this style of holdfast. I'm going to be using the style that you twist, but it still uses a 3/4 inch hole. And these work by simply twisting it down to lock it into place, but it still needs to kind of hit both sides in order to work. This requires no pounding on them to work its way down. This is what I was using back when I worked in an apartment because I didn't want to wake up all the neighbors. Now, the reason why I went with this spacing right here all these years is because of this device right here. See, I don't have an end vise that squeezes this way. I've always used this whenever I needed to. And it's just a real quick kind of setup, which, you see this screw distance is a little bit less than the distance here. So I can use the full travel of this device to tighten things up. Now, this is very slow, and over the years I've worked out techniques, so you've probably never seen me use this in a video because I generally just bump my stuff up to something firm, a cross piece or something like that. But this is the reason for this spacing. Now, how far from the edge is the other question, and I don't know why I did it all these years ago, but of the 14 workbenches I built for the school, I did them all 4 1/4 inches from either side. I don't know why I did that number, so I'm just kind of used to it. So I'm probably going to do similar on this one, but you notice if I come over to this side, if I do it at that distance, I'm going straight into my support piece. So basically, mine are going to not be equal. They'll probably be a little farther towards the center on my working side and closer to the edge on the far side. You got to work with what you got. So I now have a line at 4 1/4 and 2 1/2. I'm setting these dividers to the exact width of my old holes just so it's consistent. And because I'm vain and I want to look balanced, I'm starting in the dead center of the line. I'm just going to work my way out, and using dividers, I'm going to make indentations for my drill bit to really sink into so that it starts at the exact spot I want it to. Now, having these holes exactly the same on both sides makes doing tricks like using the dog holes as layout or bumping stuff up that's square a lot easier, because the dog holes raise up square to the edge of the table. Next, it's really important you get all your dog holes just dead square, plumb going down. I have a few of mine off because I did them by hand when I built these so many years ago. The trick I used back then was I built one of these that fairly square up. Obviously it was glued up. And then I could just put my drill bit in the corner, and that kept everything plumb. And I did all of them that way. You could, if you have a drill press and a big enough stand and stuff like that, use your drill press. This time I'm going to try something different. I just acquired this, as I showed you earlier, as a substitute for the drill press. And this should work perfectly in this application. Another option is if you have a router, one of those plunge routers, you could get all the holes started with a plunge router so you know it's going to be perfect, and then just finish them up with another tool. So with this thing, it's simply a matter of lining up the little drive spur with the hole you created, locking everything solid, and having at it. Now, if you don't want to blow out the bottom, just keep a feeling out for it. Whenever you feel that spade bit start protruding through, stop and then come from the other way. But since it's on the very bottom, I'm not really going concerned with it. Besides, I'm about to go back and round over all these holes anyway, so it'll take care of most of any blowout I get. I'll just slow down as I get towards the end. And there we go. So let's mount it up and see how too high it is. There we go. And as we can see, it's a little bit high compared to my old workbench. But what's cool about these, the legs are made out of aluminum. So once we get the height we want to take off the legs, we can fix it. Okay, I'm an idiot. I was doing it that way just because that's how I've always done chair legs and stuff like that when I'm balancing stuff out. Manufacturing these things, they did not take the time to cut these parallel with the ground, stuff like that. They just cut them square to the pieces, and they use these little plastic things at the right angles and stuff like that to make it sit right. So just take the legs off, cut them on chop saw, table saw, hand saw like that. Just cut them square and slap these things back on. I was just being stupid. Didn't really look at the full situation when I started cutting. There we go. Definitely easier to put it on upside down. But we now have ourselves a portable workbench. The last thing I'm going to do with this is I'm going to hit the top with 60 grit sandpaper to kind of scuff it up because it's just too slick. Then I'll throw a light Danish oil coat on it. That's basically just to help any glue squeeze out, be easier to clean up. I'm not really worried about protecting the finish because it's a workbench. Kind of like this one right here. That's how I treated that one there. So now to do all the other ones for my bandsaw, lathe, grinder, maybe even sharpening station, that kind of stuff like that. And the process is going to be very similar to this. So from here on out, I'm just going to show you the differences. And since we've been talking so much about grain in this video, let's start there. Earlier, we cut out this middle section, and I turned those into quarter sawn by flipping on the side and gluing them all together. And that got me that really almost 4-inch thick top. But all my other tables don't need to be that thick. I mean, they're just holding up tools. In fact, they don't even have to be that flat. You don't need a flat table just to hold up sawdust. So I'm not really concerned with that. And because I no longer have that section right there, all my other boards are either quarter sawn or bastard sawn grain. Meaning quarter sawn, a board has a grain going pretty close to 90 degrees. Where bastard sawn grain, it's kind of going more 45. And there's a scale there that we work on. Right now, because I was capturing those center sections, I have 4 12-foot long boards of that quarter bastard sawn grain, which should make quite a few tabletops. But let's say that you're just buying wood and you actually do have to use some of that flat sawn grain right there. Well, here's some theories in gluing up flat sawn boards. You know, they're going to have cathedrals on their face. And in order to make it somewhat useful after it moves a little bit, as it continues to dry in the finished piece, it all comes down to balancing out the movement. A lot of people, when they're arranging a cathedral board, will arrange it like this in a glue up. And if it's completely dry and it's going to stay in the same exact environment as it was created, it might stay relatively flat. But if there's any kind of moisture change, well, that's when things start to move. And when boards move, basically, as they tend to straighten out their grain as they dry, because less material, it just kind of shrinks down around. And as it absorbs, it kind of curves it back up. So if you were to build something out of construction lumber, which obviously hasn't hit its dry point, its equilibrium point, it is going to continue to move. If you were to do something like this, it's not the movement of the faces, because as those grains straighten out, the board's going to kind of cup like this in order to get those individual grains to run a little straighter. And in actuality, on a short board, that cupping is not going to be that big a difference. What is going to be the difference is the change of angle on either side. Because if each one of these now becomes a trapezoid, well, you can see it's got to be a huge curve in order to make that happen. Now, the typical book theory on this is to alternate the grain. That way, as each one of these goes trapezoidal, it forms a somewhat wave and the average is somewhat flat. And if you've ever looked at an old park bench or something like that, which is purposely left outside, and a lot of times I'll leave a little gap in between the boards because they're just screwing it down to a crossbeam. Well, you can kind of see if they do it that way, they're all either humped or there's kind of a graduation. Kind of just depends upon what you want to do. Me personally, on a park bench, I would rather have them all like this so that the water vents off the side. Something you ought to think about. But to me, that's all book theory and something that you might need to apply if you are in that situation. But I don't like cathedrals, so I will do everything in my power not to do face grain on a tabletop. Now, one major difference is we are doing the boards on their side. And as I've said earlier, I'm not really concerned with getting the ultimate flatness. If it looks flat, it is flat. But if you remember, whenever I put the boards on the side, I could use one clamp to bring them all together, even though they were kind of warped. Well, in this situation, if I'm doing it this way, that way, I can't really do that one. So I'm actually going to use biscuits to help alignment. Using a biscuit jointer, I'm going to set aside several biscuits along the edge, a certain distance from either the top or bottom, probably the bottom, and then come up and all boards will align to that distance, that thing, thus bending them into alignment. So at least they are flat together. And there we go. I now have 5 work surfaces I could use in a modular power tool setup or hand tool setup or however I want to do it. There's so much flexibility here. And the cool thing I think about it is, you know, you could, in a one-car garage, you could put an entire wall with a floor-to-ceiling shelving system made out of just simple construction lumber. I've done videos on that. I've done it many times myself. And this setup in there would only take, you know, what is that? 18 inches of just a little section. You could lay them up on the side so you can pull them out individually without having to sort them all out. And the little stands themselves, all of them come with this little lip, you know, a little 2x4 cut with a little lip. It just hangs on. You could hang it on the shelving itself, and then the shelves would hold all your power tool supplies and stuff like that. So in short order, you could just set up whatever kind of workstation, work setup you needed for even a power tool workshop. And for me, this isn't going to take up that much space in my truck. Granted, some of these I'm going to have set up for a specific tool, like this one right here. I'm going to actually bolt my bandsaw on there, but this doesn't add that much space to that individual bandsaw, and I can slide it in and out on these little rubber bumpers, so it will prevent it from sliding around my truck. It's just going to make everything kind of cool. So let's set up a couple workshops. So I will give it to you that in this modular pop-up power to a workshop, it's going to take you more than 5 minutes to set up everything here. But when are you going to need to set up everything? I mean, if you're just working on a Saturday, you pretty much have your given goals, so you can do just the tools you need. So here's a quick tour of it. I have my hand tool woodworking station, which is going to include my bench and a kind of catch-all table behind me, because that's just how I like to work. It keeps my tools here, sharpening station, that kind of stuff. If I need to do any sanding, I can grab my sander back there. If I want to do some scroll work, I can bring out my scroll saw, set it up on one of the excess tables. Maybe I'm just doing a production turning day. In that case, generally, I'm probably only going to bring out my lathe and grinder. Now, I will give you this. I still need to cut the legs off on my on this stand right here, because you really want your lathe to be about your elbow height for your shoulders, but I've already shown you how you can do that one. I might bring out my bandsaw if I'm producing stock for the lathe work. But other than that, you know, just bring out what you need when you need it. I have my thickness planer, bandsaw, scroll saw, miter box, and all of these long ones can extend their arms out so you can hang stuff off of if you need more storage. You have storage underneath them for toolboxes and whatnot. And pretty much every tool here I have run on a battery powered generator before. The only one I just drained the batteries way too fast, I probably would only use on a gas generator, would be my thickness planer. But that's just me. You know, if I'm out in the Grand Canyon and I want to make a bunch of tops, I got this. Most of y'all have extension cords. Well, I'm happy with this. I think it's going to work out great for me when I'm out on the road. And I do see that this could really work great for a lot of y'all out there that just don't have space. Space limitations like I do working out of a pickup. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. You've got a few tips, learned a lot about grain and grain orientation, and figure out some ideas that might work for you. Y'all be safe, have fun, and remember, it's always worth the effort to learn, create stuff, and share it with others.